was an ordinary afternoon at JFK Airport, but for one particular flight, something extraordinary was about to unfold. Melania Trump, former First Lady of the United States, had just wrapped up a week packed with events, meetings, and public appearances. Instead of taking a private jet as many would expect, she quietly booked a commercial flight. She wasn't trying to make a statement, she simply wanted a sense of normalcy, a quiet space to breathe away from flashing cameras and constant attention. Wearing a soft cream-colored turtleneck, tailored dark slacks, and large sunglasses that concealed much of her face, Melania walked through the terminal almost unnoticed. Her only accessory was a small black handbag. With minimal makeup and an effortless sense of poise, she looked like any other well-put-together woman, elegant but far from showy. To the casual observer, she didn't stand out, and that was exactly how she wanted it. When she stepped onto the plane and took her seat in first class, most people barely looked twice. She moved with grace but never called attention to herself. The window seat suited her, quiet, tucked away, a rare moment of peace. But that peace didn't last long. Sarah Montgomery, the head flight attendant, was making her usual rounds, double-checking the first-class manifest. With 15 years of experience, she took pride in maintaining perfection. Everything from the lighting to the seating arrangements had to be just right. As she scanned the cabin, her eyes landed on Melania. Something didn't sit right. The woman's outfit was too simple. No designer bag, no flashy watch, no jewelry. Sarah's instinct told her something was off. She couldn't shake the feeling. To her, first-class passengers always had a certain look, a presence. And this woman, while composed, didn't fit that image. Doubt crept in. Was this someone who'd slipped into the wrong cabin? Was this a security risk? Without realizing who she was speaking to, Sarah approached Melania to recheck her ticket. What she believed was diligence was, in truth, driven by bias, a quiet assumption that someone who looked ordinary didn't belong in a place of privilege. And so began the moment that would define not just that flight, but the careers and hearts of everyone involved. Sarah Montgomery had spent over 15 years in the skies, serving first-class passengers with the highest level of professionalism. She'd built her reputation on order, elegance, and attention to detail. Everything had to meet a standard: polished shoes, pressed uniforms, sparkling champagne glasses, and passengers who looked the part. To Sarah, first class wasn't just about seating, it was about an image, an atmosphere, an experience. So when she noticed a quiet, simply dressed woman in row 2, something didn't align. The woman had no designer handbag, no diamond earrings, no high-end fashion logos peeking from her collar. Just a soft cream sweater, dark slacks, and a pair of oversized sunglasses resting on the seat beside her. Everything about her was neat and composed, but understated. Sarah's instincts, sharpened by years of experience and past incidents, whispered a warning. A small voice in her head started drawing conclusions based on the woman's appearance alone. She doesn't look like she belongs here. She remembered a past flight when a man, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, had snuck into first class using an old ticket. It had cost Sarah and her crew a formal reprimand. Since then, she had promised herself she would never let her guard down. Not on her watch. Looking back at the woman, unbothered, quiet, and seemingly out of place, Sarah began to second-guess the validity of her presence. The ticket checked out, yes, but something still felt off. Maybe it was the simplicity. Maybe it was the composure that bordered on mysterious. Or maybe, deep down, it was Sarah's own unconscious bias rising to the surface. She didn't dislike the woman, she didn't even know her. But something in Sarah equated wealth and power with visibility, luxury, and flash. This passenger didn't fit the mold. And so, rather than trusting the verified information in front of her, Sarah let the absence of extravagance feed her suspicion. To her, the woman seemed too simple to belong in first class. That silent judgment, based not on fact but on assumptions, would soon lead to a confrontation that neither of them would forget. In trying to uphold a standard of excellence, Sarah was about to be confronted with a more important truth. Appearances don't always reflect status, and sometimes humility wears the face of greatness. When Sarah returned to Melania's seat for the second time, the air in the first-class cabin had already begun to shift. The quiet hum of conversation was replaced by a subtle tension. Passengers were starting to notice the interaction. But through it all, Melania remained composed, her calm presence unshaken by the growing attention. She looked up slowly, her clear blue eyes meeting Sarah's with a steady gaze. There was no anger, no frustration, just a quiet strength. When Sarah requested another verification of her identity, Melania didn't raise her voice or object. Instead, she gently placed her magazine down, reached into her bag, and handed over her ticket once more. Her expression remained neutral, her movements deliberate, as though she had nothing to prove. Sarah, however, was growing more unsettled. Most people, especially those who paid for a luxury seat, would have shown signs of irritation by now. But Melania's silence wasn't passive. It held power. Her poise, the subtle confidence in her tone and posture, created more discomfort in Sarah than if she had argued. "Ma'am?" Sarah pressed, her voice now firmer. "If you cannot provide further identification, I may need to ask you to leave this cabin." That was the moment everything shifted. Melania sat up straighter, her hands folded gently on her lap. Her voice was soft but carried weight. "I believe the ticket should be sufficient. I'm simply here for a peaceful flight." Her response wasn't defensive, it was resolute. She didn't try to impress or demand recognition. She simply asked for the same respect any passenger should receive. The elegance in her manner, the unshakable calm, began to draw attention from fellow passengers. Whispers spread. Some started to recognize her face. Others just noticed the dignity in how she carried herself. Sarah, on the other hand, was starting to lose control of the moment. Her professional pride, once firm, was now at odds with a growing sense of uncertainty. Still, Melania didn't press her advantage. She didn't embarrass her, didn't call her out. She let the truth reveal itself in time. In a world where power often shouts to be heard, Melania spoke with silence and grace. Her restraint was not weakness, it was strength. And for those watching, it was clear. The most powerful presence in the room wasn't loud or flashy. It was the woman who stayed calm, even when wrongly judged. The tension in the cabin had reached a quiet peak. Sarah stood firm, still convinced she was upholding airline protocol. Melania, on the other hand, remained calm, her eyes steady, her tone unwavering. The quiet resistance she offered wasn't just polite, it was dignified. Still, Sarah pushed forward, pressing for further verification, believing she was doing her job. Around them, the first-class passengers had begun to whisper among themselves. Some watched curiously, others uncomfortably. A few leaned over to their seatmates, exchanging guesses. One middle-aged man seated a row behind narrowed his eyes and tilted his head as if trying to remember something. Then it happened. "Wait a minute," the man said aloud, rising slightly from his seat. "Don't you recognize her?" His voice cut through the cabin like a sharp note in a quiet psalm. Heads turned. The silence was instant. "That's Melania Trump," he said clearly, pointing gently toward her seat. "That's the former First Lady of the United States." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Several passengers turned to get a better look. Others pulled out their phones discreetly, searching for pictures to confirm what they were now almost certain of. The resemblance was undeniable, those poised features, the signature composure, the effortless elegance. It wasn't just a resemblance. It was her. Sarah froze. A wave of shock washed over her as she stared at the woman she had just accused of not belonging. The realization hit her all at once. The quiet confidence, the calm refusal to be rattled, the dignified silence, it all made sense now. She hadn't been dealing with just another passenger. She had challenged a woman recognized around the world. Embarrassment flushed her cheeks. Her heart raced. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt truly exposed, not because of what Melania had done, but because of what she had failed to see. Melania didn't react with arrogance or bitterness. She didn't gloat or demand an apology. She simply looked at Sarah, still composed, and said nothing. And in that silence, Sarah heard more than any reprimand could deliver. The atmosphere shifted entirely. What had begun as quiet suspicion turned into stunned recognition. A misunderstanding had been laid bare, and it wasn't Melania who had anything to prove. It was everyone else who had to reflect on what they had assumed and why. As the realization sank in, Sarah Montgomery felt the weight of her mistake crush down on her like never before. The woman she had doubted, questioned, and nearly asked to leave the first-class cabin was Melania Trump, someone she should have recognized not just by face but by the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. And now, every passenger knew it too. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Some passengers shook their heads. Others whispered criticisms, their voices tinged with disbelief and disappointment. How could she not recognize her? One said. That was way out of line, another muttered. Every word landed like a sting. Sarah stood frozen. Her professionalism, something she had always taken pride in, was unraveling in real time. She had built her career on attention to detail, composure, and fairness. But now, she had let something else seep in. Judgment. And not just any judgment bias, the kind that hides behind standards and protocol but really boils down to assumptions. Melania hadn't done anything wrong. She had a valid ticket, she followed the rules, and she never raised her voice. The only reason Sarah had singled her out was because she didn't look the part. No designer logos. No flashy presence. Just quiet elegance. And somehow, that wasn't enough. It wasn't just a professional mistake. It was a personal wake-up call. Back in the service area, Sarah tried to regain her composure, but her hands trembled. Her mind raced through every decision she had made on that flight, replaying the moment she doubted Melania, the tone she used, the way she had looked at her scrutinizing, dismissive. For the first time in her long career, Sarah wasn't sure she had been protecting the standards of service or simply defending her own prejudice. She looked at her younger colleague Emily, who had tried earlier to suggest that maybe simplicity didn't mean inauthenticity. Sarah hadn't listened. But now, the truth was staring her in the face. It wasn't about Melania being famous. It was about how easily Sarah had let appearances shape her judgment. And as she heard Melania's calm, unwavering voice reminding her that respect shouldn't depend on identity, she realized something deeper. This wasn't just about one flight or one mistake. It was about the kind of person she wanted to be going forward. And that realization hurt, but it was exactly what she needed. Amaka stepped out of prison a free woman, but nothing felt different. The sky was open, the air was clean, but inside, she still felt caged. The whispers of shame had followed her outside the walls. She had served her time for a crime she didn't commit, but the curse, the real prison, was still alive. The lawyer Chaik felt her pain. He had seen enough to know she wasn't the monster people made her out to be. So when he offered her a place to stay, a room in his quiet home on the edge of the city, Amaka didn't know what to say. She just nodded, grateful and unsure all at once. The first few weeks were peaceful. Chaik treated her with respect. He never looked at her the way others had. He gave her space. He even found her a church nearby, hoping she'd find strength to rebuild. For a moment, Amaka dared to hope. But the curse wasn't done with her yet. It started with a neighbor. Then another. Men she didn't even know began showing up when Sheik was away. She tried to resist, but her body betrayed her again and again. Something inside her snapped every time she was alone with a man. It was like watching herself from outside her body, unable to scream, unable to stop. And just like before, the rumors began. Neighbors whispered. Eyes followed her again. Chaik heard things, small things at first, then bolder confessions. He wanted to believe they weren't true. But one day, he came home early and found her with his own security guard. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He just looked at her like a man watching something beautiful collapse. I trusted you, he said quietly. Amaka fell to her knees, sobbing. I didn't want this. I'm trying to stop. I'm trying. But even she didn't believe her words anymore. Chaik gave her one more chance. She swore she'd change. But a few days later, she was caught again, this time with a neighbor's husband. The woman stormed into Chaik's house screaming. That was the final blow. Chaik, broken-hearted, told her she had to leave. So once again, Amaka packed her things in silence, carrying nothing but her past and a curse that refused to let her go. With nowhere else to turn, she went back to the last place she ever wanted to see again. The village. The moment Amaka stepped foot back into the village, the air felt heavier. People stared. Some laughed, others turned their backs. Children pointed and whispered. Women she once mocked now looked at her with cruel satisfaction. Where's your pride now, chief's daughter? Beauty doesn't save you from shame. Amaka said nothing. Her head stayed low. She barely left her room. Day and night she cried, sometimes from guilt, sometimes from helplessness. Her parents tried to comfort her, but they too were broken. Her father had aged beyond his years. Her mother, once lively, barely spoke above a whisper. They searched for the old woman who had cursed her, asked around the village, reached out to travelers, but no one had seen her in years. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The curse, however, had not. It clung to Amaka like a second skin. Even in her despair, she couldn't trust herself to be around men. Her body still betrayed her, pulling her into actions she didn't want, deepening the shame she carried like a chain around her soul. One afternoon, as she sat outside watching the wind rustle the dry leaves, her mother quietly said, "There's a man of God. He lives 2 villages away. People say he helps those who are truly lost." At first, Amaka hesitated. She had stopped believing anything could save her, but something in her mother's voice, a quiet hope, pushed her to try. She packed a small bag and left before sunrise the next day. The man of God was older, gentle, and kind. He welcomed her into his home without question. When Amaka sat down and finally told her story from the insult to the curse, from the prison to the shame, he listened with deep compassion. Not once did he interrupt. When she finished, tears running freely, he looked her in the eyes and said, "My child, the woman who cursed you is gone, but your freedom doesn't depend on her anymore." It never did. Amaka stared at him, confused. "You will break this kind of curse with effort," he continued. "You break it by surrendering, fully. You give your life to God, not just your pain, but your pride, your past, your everything." And for the first time, Amaka truly understood. There, on her knees, in a stranger's living room, Amaka wept and prayed like never before. She poured out every dark memory, every regret, every ounce of shame. She asked for forgiveness. She gave God her broken pieces. And in return, she felt something she hadn't known in years. Peace. Not the peace that comes from silence, but the kind that comes when chains finally fall. After that day, Amaka never returned to who she used to be. The curse didn't vanish overnight, but something had shifted. For the first time in years, she could feel her soul breathing again. She stayed near the man of God, learning, praying, rebuilding piece by piece the woman she had lost. Her beauty remained, but it was no longer her identity. What radiated now was something deeper: humility, wisdom, and peace. The villagers noticed. Whispers began again, but this time, they were different. "She's not like before. She looks calm. Maybe she really changed." Amaka didn't try to defend herself. She just lived quietly, helping others, teaching young girls, comforting those who had known pain. She became a quiet voice of healing in the same village where she had once caused division. Her parents, though forever scarred by the journey, stood by her side with pride. The chief smiled again, not because his daughter was perfect, but because she had found her way back. A few years later, a kind, well-respected businessman who had recently moved to the village met Amaka at a local gathering. He had heard the rumors everyone had, but he saw the woman she was now, not the girl she used to be. Slowly, gently, he pursued her heart, not her body. And when he asked for her hand in marriage, Amaka cried not out of fear but gratitude. They married in a quiet, beautiful ceremony. People came not to gossip, but to celebrate. They had children together, built a peaceful home, and Amaka never stopped telling her story. She didn't hide her past. She shared it boldly with young women who thought beauty was everything, with girls who didn't know their worth, and even with proud hearts who looked down on the poor. Because Amaka had learned what many never do: pride can ruin you faster than poverty. And true freedom only begins when you stop fighting and start surrendering. Her life became a living testimony that no matter how far you fall, no matter how deep the shame, redemption is real. But it only comes through truth, humility, and the grace of God. And maybe that's what this story is truly about. Not just curses or consequences, but the way life sometimes breaks us only so we can become someone better. So if you've ever messed up, felt too far gone, or believed the worst about yourself, take heart. Like Amaka, you too can rise again.